Yes.
I'm going to turn to you now, Professor Bellamy, to ask about the SABRE system and the reporting system from the SHOT perspective, the distinction and overlap with the MHRA. Perhaps a way to help visualise this is to bring up the SHOT document, the SHOT or Not Guide to Reporting,
yes,
which is at RLIT 001805. If I could ask you just to give us a brief description of what this document is and who it's intended for.
yes. So this is a document intended for the group of people we refer to as our reporters. In other words, those people in hospitals and health boards who make the reports to us. Typically, it would be transfusion nurses, laboratory specialists, and so on. And it's to there are a number of categories under which they can make a report, according to, there's this one, for example. This is a new one, acknowledging continuing excellence. We've only had that for the last year or so, and that's supposed to be a slightly more positive one, to highlight good practices, to roll those out more widely. ADU, avoiding delayed and under or over transfusion. That's it's self-explanatory. The reason I think it's worth me just mentioning it is because if you look at our most recent report, our 2021 report, which was published in July of this year, our two leading causes of harms are delayed transfusion, and where the, for example, major hemorrhage protocols don't work, or where a transfusion is required and there are delays, and those delays result in harms. And the other group is what we call TACO, transfusion-associated circulatory overload, so people who are transfused inappropriately and too much and suffer harms as a result of those. And so on. We can go through the document looking at the category under which something might be reported or might not be reported.
Could I just highlight a couple of examples from this? If we look at the bottom of that page, that first page, we're in a section called Release of Components. And if we look, the last entry, incorrect blood group or incorrect component type selected. The first, we go over to the next column, collection, and the X there says that doesn't have to be reported to SHOT. Now, should we understand that that may be mandatorily reported to the MHRA, but it just doesn't come to SHOT?
Correct. And that would be my understanding anyway.
The next column is administration. So this is the process of transfusing the patient, and as the chair was saying just before the break, the process of putting the blood into the arm. And that's got a tick saying that does have to be, or we'll come on to whether it's mandatory or professionally mandatory in a second, but that says do report this to SHOT. And the code there is NM, so that's near miss.
Yep.
And WCT is wrong components transfused. So those are the codes that the reporter should use if making that kind of report. And then finally, post-transfusion. So this is a problem which is identified post-transfusion. That too should also be reported to SHOT.
Yes.
And this isn't saying don't report it to the MHRA as well. They're just identifying the areas that you are, as SHOT, will be interested in.
Yes, so to explain that in a, to take it away from a sheet with crosses and ticks on it, what's the rationale behind it? As Dr. Cave explained earlier, the MHRA reportable things have to do with the integrity of the product and how it's handled. Our interest is slightly broader, and it's not to do with the manufacturing and so on of the product, but it is to do with certainly how it's handled, the mistakes people make in selecting the wrong product, the way the wrong product might get into a patient, whether that causes harm or not.
A question which has been raised by several core participants, and the answer to which is identifiable here, is whether or not that includes a decision to use a blood transfusion when one is not necessary.
That's a very interesting one, and perhaps later on we might also come back to the JPAC document, which talks about requirements for documenting transfusion. One of those requirements being the indication for transfusion. Why was a decision made to transfuse at all, and why was a decision made to use that product? SHOT is very interested in this because, again, one of our major causes of mortality in our last report, I think in last year we can look at the report, but 35 or 36 deaths, major complications. 27 of those were related to transfusion-associated circulatory overload. So you have to ask the question in those situations, was it ever appropriate to give that blood or that fresh frozen plasma or whatever in the first place? So we're very interested in the reasons why transfusion decisions are made. And trying to bust some of the mythology around that decision making.
We'll come back to that, as you say. Let's turn then to the question of whether it is mandatory or professionally mandatory to make these reports to SHOT. Now, we've heard from Dr. Cave that there is a legal requirement on a hospital to report instance that the regulations require to be reported to the MHRA. We are dealing here now with matters which are outside of those regulations. So could you explain what the requirement is upon either healthcare professionals or their institutions to make reports to SHOT?
Yes, it's a rather more difficult one because it is somewhat opaque, and my understanding of it is probably as cloudy as anybody else's. The bit around the things which are, the reporting of which are legally mandated is simple. Those are the things which are reported to the MHRA under the Blood Safety and Quality Regulations 2005 as amended 2006 and more recently. When the SHOT scheme was set up in '96, there was no requirement at all to report anything to it. Since then, we have tried to introduce a requirement. Now, that requirement is not supported by statute in any way. There's no legal framework which says, thou shalt report this error. We do say, we use this term professionally mandated, which is that the professions say you must report it, and the reporting process is linked to the clinical negligence arrangements for trusts. Although the exact mechanics of how that works, I'm afraid I don't know.
When you say the professions say that you must report it, are you talking about General Medical Council, Nursing and Midwifery Council?
Yes.
Would it be helpful, so far as SHOT is concerned, to have a legally mandated reporting system?
Yes, it would. Because we know that there is a large level of underreporting. 2021 was the first year in which we received a report from all of the hospitals and health boards in the UK. It simply isn't credible that years go by when no hospital has a near miss. We know from comparator data in other countries, similar countries to ourselves like the Northern European countries, the Netherlands and so on, that the level of underreporting may be very significant indeed. My colleagues in the Netherlands have estimated that for some categories the level of underreporting of near misses is around perhaps one in 300 cases get reported. Now, we don't know if that's the same situation in the UK, but it would surprise me if we were very much better than comparable Northern European nations. So I think for near misses, there is a tendency not to report things. But if you want a system which is robust, which is going to stop the real harm from taking place, you're not going to do that by waiting until that real harm occurs. You need to recognise the patterns beforehand. You need to recognise the behaviours, the practices, the systems errors which lead to those near misses. Because only if you get rid of all the near misses that you're going to stop the eventual actual event from happening. So that this, if you didn't, for example, have a system reporting wrong blood in tube, you would be very, even if that doesn't then result in a transfusion reaction, you would be very unlikely to prevent the transfusion reactions.
So you feel that this system should be placed on a statutory basis with a mandate that such instance must be reported to SHOT? It's
difficult to see how the mechanics of that would work. However, what you could, I think the existing regulations were a little bit too flimsy and nebulous, whereas what is laid out for the MHRA reporting scheme and the BSQR is absolutely clear. It may be possible to mandate trusts to have a designated person in place for reporting haemovigilance issues, rather than leaving that to the discretion of a trust, rather than linking it to clinical negligence schemes. Because if you don't mandate it, it will become the victim of a budget cut at some point. It will be on somebody's priority list, but never quite reaching the top. It's important that this does reach the top and stays at the top. And unless there is some form of statutory, shall we say, encouragement to do that, it ain't going to happen.
I'm going to turn to the other members of the panel and ask them for their views on this proposal. If I could start with you, Professor Neuberger. What are your views on the idea of having a statutory requirement that there is somebody in each hospital trust or relevant organisation who is placed in charge of haemovigilance and reporting?
My initial thought is very much in favour of that. It won't necessarily solve the problem, but it will certainly go some way, giving some authority to people and requirement on all those hospital boards and trusts under pressure, at least to make sure there's something in place. As I say, I think it's a good start. I think mandating clinicians to do something with the legal requirement goes against the grain, and I'm not sure how effective that would be. But I think having a hospital having somebody statutorily responsible would be a very useful start.
Are there any disadvantages or unintended consequences that you see from that kind of a proposal?
No, I think they wouldn't. There's one thing, I'll come back. I don't think you address some of the issues, particularly that are addressing this inquiry, with those adverse events that occur late. Most of these are focusing on immediate ones, where I think the blood transfusionists are pretty well geared up, and the laboratories are pretty well geared up to detecting them. They may not report them as well, but where I think the big gap, which is much more difficult, is the latent infections which are not clinically apparent. And I can elaborate on that later, perhaps, if you wish.
We will come back to that. Am I right in understanding you saying that this isn't a silver bullet, but it's something that you would broadly support, the haemovigilance role?
I can't immediately think of any adverse impact. Obviously, it's a requirement. It's another commitment against an already overstretched workforce and budget. But to my mind, it's a very important one.
Dr. Cave, I appreciate you may be perhaps don't have the same freedom to speak here as your colleagues, as you are somebody who is employed by the MHRA. But would the MHRA have a view, or do you have a personal view that you can express on this question?
So I was just revisiting what the BSQRs actually do mandate. So I think it's important to understand that they do mandate an SAE, an event, an untoward occurrence associated with collecting, testing, processing and storing and distribution that might lead. So they do allow for near misses within that. And they do mandate for an adverse reaction, an unintended response in a donor or a patient associated with collection or transfer. So there is a requirement already. I suppose the gap that you're pointing out there is the near miss is not specifically mandated there. I guess personally, I think what we need to encourage is a system-wide culture for reporting. I wonder whether if one person is delegated, whether that then removes responsibility from the system to report. Generally, I think a simplification of the system as much as possible so that it's easy to report. Most of our systems are geared now to facilitating that report, making the report as easy as possible to submit. And I think that would have an impact. I mean, looking through this form, it is quite complex. It could be a deterrent to reporting by the time you've got down to the bottom of it. In pharmacovigilance, we ask for any reaction suspected to be associated with a drug or medical device to be reported to us. So we have sort of more open sort of requirements around that to encourage reporting, and we then do the analysis down the line as to whether we feel there is a causal relationship or a suspected causal relationship that might require mitigation. So I guess my only concern with putting one person in charge, could they do an entire hospital? And how do we best encourage everyone in the hospital to take responsibility for reporting events and make that as easy and simple for them as possible? Because I think that's one really effective way to encourage reporting.
Professor Bellamy, could I ask your reflections on those observations?
First of all, to reflect on Professor Newberger's observation, do I see any downsides to it? Yes, competition for resources being the one that he identified. But the other thing is that if there is a significant stick associated with the carrot, we already have a problem which we've highlighted recently in the laboratory culture survey of people feeling pressured to either not report or alter their reports, sanitize, shall we say, their reports so as to reflect well on their laboratory or institution. So I think that that's a potential pitfall. Now, what was I going to say about Dr. Cave's point of view? Yes, I almost agree with Dr. Cave regarding having a wide responsibility spread across a number of individuals for doing that reporting. To make sure the reports are done properly, though, and with a high enough quality and level of consistency, degree of consistency, I think it's important that there should be a process of accountability, and for there to be a process of accountability, there has to be an accountable individual who has overall sight of that process. Doesn't mean that individual has to do all of the reports themselves. It does mean that individual perhaps delegates that to a smaller team of trusted individuals who can conduct the local investigation to an appropriate level of rigour and report appropriately, accurately and in a timely fashion.
We will come back to the wider question of cultures, but we will leave the question of a dedicated member of staff for haemovigilance there.
May I just ask this? You say, Professor Bellamy, that your understanding is that the current mechanism which is said to to enforce or support a process of reporting is the clinical negligence.
I understand that, and as I say, this is an area around which I am quite woolly, so I apologise for not being able to give you a detailed answer. This is a question I discussed recently with Dr. Narayan, our medical director, to say exactly how does professionally mandated work. And it's quite difficult in SHOT's own SOPs and literature to find very much relating to that. The response Dr. Narayan gave to me is that this is around the responsibilities of a doctor, professional responsibilities as laid out, for example, in GMC documentation, and relating to what used to be called the Clinical Negligence Scheme for Trusts. It keeps changing its name, of course. But I can't give you a detailed answer, I'm afraid.
The reason I ask is that clinical negligence suggests that it's looking at an adverse event so far as the patient is concerned, which has actually happened, whereas your concern is avoiding that in the first place by identifying the near miss.
Yes.
And so the question is how that mandates, as it were, the reporting of the near miss.
Well, there is an essential disconnect there, isn't there? Which I suppose, again, would reinforce the view that actually we need a process where there is an individual who is named within the organisation, where there's a line of accountability, and where the process is external to that, or the accountability is external to that trust. For example, a statutory requirement or a broader NHS rule.
And is it an answer, in part at any rate, to the problem of labs wanting to present their institution in the best possible light and therefore perhaps not reporting? That's what must be happening now. Perhaps would it be any different if you had a person obligatory with a job, I should say, with the obligation to ensure proper reporting?
So I can't see culture change happening as a result of one individual change, but I think that individual change is part of a broader package of measures which potentially could bring about more of a focus on human factors investigation, a broader culture change to adjust culture, and the PSURF initiative also covers this quite well, and a better defined structure for accountability for reporting, which is what I've been suggesting to Mr. Hill.
So on the journey towards those goals, this may be at least a step.
I think it's a step. As Professor Newberg has also pointed out, it's a step in the right direction. It's not sufficient in itself.
Can we return to the joint guidance document between SHOT and MHRA? And we could have on screen, please, NHBT 0203834_0, page 22 of that document. This picks up on a point that the Chair has just made and that you have been discussing. What the joint guidance document says is this: the MHRA and SHOT are very keen to ensure that reporting to the UK Haemovigilance system does not interfere with or replace existing local reporting systems, e.g. local risk management reporting systems. Just pausing there, what is meant here by local systems of reporting?
Okay, historically, and in most trusts apart from the pilot sites at the moment, the local system would be incident or near miss occurs, local report is made, there is an internal investigation, usually a root cause analysis investigation, which may come up with local suggestions or solutions. In the future, I know I've been going on quite a lot about PSURF, but it is happening as we speak, that we're in that transition period. It remains to be seen how effectively that replaces the existing local systems, but it is a completely new framework and approach, taking very much more a human factors approach to this problem. So I would hope would be more effective than the traditional root cause analysis, which tends to look for a single root cause rather than looking at the interactions between multiple parts of a system.
So we should understand, should we, that when an individual comes to make a report to the MHRA and or SHOT, that same individual, the same institution, will have instigated a local report as well, in many cases.
They may, and it is desirable that they should have done.
And so I've been asked to remind those watching and listening that evidence, for example, of the NHS-BT system has been given by Gail Mifflin in her witness statement. We won't go into that now, but just to make clear that this isn't the only game in town.
Yeah.
Could I turn to the question of patient reporting? Do you accept reports, the SHOT accept reports directly from patients in relation to blood and blood components?
I can't think of specific examples where we have done, but in principle, we could do.
Do you know why it is that it's not something which has been done before?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I suspect it's because we've not had enough of a public presence. Although we have a lot of patient representatives, have had patient representatives over the year at our annual conference and so on, we try and always have patient representatives present and as speakers. That's one-way traffic. That's traffic into us reflecting on what patients' experience is, but it doesn't put us out there in the public domain so much as as an area that patients could report to. And for that reason, we don't have a specific reporting portal for patients to log on to and input their experiences either. That said, our contact details are available. Anyone is very welcome to self-report a situation. It may or may not fall into one of our categories and definitions and therefore may or may not get analysed. But that's a later stage. Until we've got the report, we don't know where it would sit.
Is that a matter to which more consideration may be given by SHOT in coming months and years?
I can certainly take that back to the steering group. I can't see any reason in principle why we wouldn't do it. I think it's simply that we've not previously been asked to do that by our patient representatives. Had they asked us to do that, I suspect we'd have done it by now.
Dr. Kay, for the MHRA, of course, the regulations don't place any responsibilities on the patients, but would the MHRA accept reports from patients?
So we, through the SABRE system, we accept reports from individuals on behalf of organisations because that's where our responsibility lies. Obviously, if it's a blood product, we welcome and encourage reports from patients. And certainly through the yellow card system, I would understand there is sufficient flexibility for a patient to report through that route under the there is an other category. I understand that, we could accept reports and welcome reports through that route as well. So again, it comes back to the slightly different routes of reporting. The yellow card, which takes reports from patients, publics, and healthcare professionals, and then the SABRE system, which for us is obviously focused on the collection and distribution and testing of blood, but the yellow card could provide a route for patients to report directly to us.
That is something that Dr. Rain mentioned on Monday as well. So, I'm going to turn briefly, I'm afraid it will be brief, given the length and depth of the document, to the annual SHOT report from 2021, which was published this year.
Yes.
If we could have on screen, please, Lawrence, SHOT 5032. This is a document which is some 250 pages long and is very detailed. It's available online. I don't mean any disrespect to those who have produced it, but we're going to touch on it really quite lightly. People can look it up online to see the amount of work that has gone into it. So this is what is produced by SHOT and by the working expert groups. And as you say, it's disseminated and then it is followed up. There are just a couple of points that I would like to look at from this report, the most recent of the reports. Could we go to page 8, please? I'm sorry, page 9. We can see here a diagram showing the distinction between reports submitted to SHOT and reports submitted to the MHRA in the calendar year 2021. We can see 4,088 reports submitted altogether, and then 2,871 went to SHOT, 1,523 went to the MHRA, and reports in common 1,045. And then there are statistics for incomplete reports and withdrawn reports. If we go a little further down, firstly, can I ask why a report would be withdrawn?
That would depend on the individual report, but it's unlikely. It's possible that it could be withdrawn because of incomplete data, uninterpretable data, misclassification. Once we've gone through the detail, it may be found to have not actually been reportable in the first place. It tends to be for those sorts of reasons. The reports we receive contain a lot of information, but there's also quite a lot of noise in that. So once the working expert group have reviewed those, they are not all admissible.
If we could go to the top of the next paragraph, it says, during 2021, 100% of UK NHS trusts and health boards involved in transfusion submitted reports. And this is the first year that there have been received from all registered trusts and health boards since participation was first analysed in the annual SHOT report. And that's the point that you've just made.
Yes.
It is not until 2021 that has been achieved. And the report notes that this is commendable in what has been another difficult year for NHS staff. Following on from that, there were 19 non-NHS organisations that submitted 49 reports. What would those organisations be?
Typically, those would be independent sector hospitals. The area where we've struggled to get representation and involvement, although the number of transfusions in those areas is probably very small, are general practitioner-run units. But independent hospitals, for example, would be included in that.
Do you know why it's been a struggle to get information from GP-run units?
I suspect because the numbers are small, the numbers of transfusions administered there would be extremely small. We've also not got a representative member from the Royal College of General Practitioners on our steering group, although we have approached them to nominate a representative.
They have elected not to do so thus far.
Indeed.
Page 21, please, Lawrence. This is the data that has been collected in 2021 in table 3.5. And we can see the figures that are given there for the different categories that SHOT have in place for their reports. And we see the most prevalent is near miss. Then we have anti-D and anti-D immunoglobulin errors. I won't go through all of them, but if we move down further down, TACO, transfusion-associated circulatory overload, that is that which you referred to earlier, that was 131 reports, and then avoidable transfusions are 116. Further down, we can see TTI, transfusion-transmitted infection, 0. So no reports of any transfusion-transmitted infection in 2021. Is that right?
That is correct. There were There were 8, I think, if it's in the text in that chapter somewhere. There were I think there were 10 reports, 8 of which were subsequently investigated and found not to be transmission-transmitted infection. There were 2 others which were indeterminate. There were none where we could definitely attribute infection transmission to transfusion, using a set of criteria of somebody being infected after the transfusion, whereas they weren't before, and either the blood or blood product they were given was positive for an organ for the agent in question, or the donor was. There are, of course, other routes by which people can become infected.
If we look at the next table down, figure 3.6, this report in 2021 was the Jubilee report. It was 25 years of SHOT being in existence, and cumulative data is given here. And we can see the different categories for that period, 1996 to 2021, 27,008 reports analysed. We can see incorrect blood components transfused is the largest category of around 6,000. TTI, transfusion transmitted infection, is the third one down, a relatively small number in comparison to some of the other reports. Later in the report, it's at page 203, more detail is given, but there were 42 confirmed transfusion transmitted infections in that period, using the definition that you've just explained. Those involved 35 donors. The most common infections were 12 with hepatitis B and 12 with hepatitis E, and all except 2 of the hepatitis E infections were before RNA screening was introduced in 2017. We will come back to hepatitis E later and ask Professor Newberg in particular about Sabto's thoughts on that. Am I right in thinking that the period given there, 1996 to 2021, is when those infections were detected, not necessarily when they were caused?
It's when the reports were made.
Yes.
And that may be when the when the infections were detected. Certainly, but it may have been an indeterminate time after they were detected, and an even less determinate time after they were caused.
So the correct way of reading this is that there have been 42 reports of transfusion transmitted infections between 1996 and 2021.
That's how I think it should be read, yes.
The conclusion that is contained in the report at page 26. We could just highlight the section on entitled conclusion. First of all, did you write this as the chairman of the committee?
No, I didn't. Shruti Narayan drafted this out, and a number of us were involved with putting marker pens through it afterwards.
But ultimately, this is what was published by SHOT.
Yes.
Transfusion remains very safe, with very few serious incidents or deaths related to pathological events. However, patients continue to be at risk from potentially preventable causes, particularly TACO, that's transfusion associated.
Circulatory overload, yes.
And avoidable transfusion delays. Error-related transfusion incidents continue to be the largest group reported to SHOT, and it is essential that the learning from incidents reported to SHOT inform healthcare improvements. Errors made at any point in the transfusion pathway can have serious patient impact, and interventions introduced to address/prevent these must be system-orientated and sustainable. And then you talk in the second paragraph about the importance of reporting and acting upon near-miss events. If I can ask you first, Professor Bellamy, and then you, Professor Newberger, for your general reflections on what the 2021 report shows in terms of the data that SHOT collected.
I can break this down into data related to transfusion, transmissible infection and error in general. As regards transfusion transmissible infection, it shows that we're doing reasonably well as regards those infective agents that we know about at the moment. Hepatitis E is an interesting one. I'm sure Professor Newberg will come back to that, because part of the process of minimizing transfusion associated or transmitted infections is by screening out higher risk donors. And that's a more difficult process with hepatitis E, because it can be transmitted in a number of ways, including through food and so on. So it's actually quite difficult to spot the potential at-risk donor. Nevertheless, we're reasonably good in terms of the data we've collected at dealing with the infections that we know about. But there's still a huge amount of transfusion-related error going on. A huge number of near misses. You probably saw on that graph back on page 8, there were over 1,000 near misses reported, and any one of those could have turned into an actual event and caused harm. Yes, if we go back to page 8, there was a graph.
I think actually it may have been, turn my page, page 21.
Who was it? I beg your pardon. I misled you. So yes, at the top bar there, you can see 1,015 near misses. And we put a squiggly bar through it because it's so big, it doesn't fit.
I think 1,155, isn't it?
Yes.
Sorry, you're quite right. I've misread that. So 3 times the size of the next largest category. Now, that's based on the reports that were made, but we know that there's substantial underreporting. So in terms of how well are we doing in terms of haemovigilance, well, we're vulnerable in 3 areas. We're vulnerable in terms of what people report, what they choose to report, and when they have the ability to report it. At SHOT, we're potentially vulnerable because we're a pretty small organisation with a very small staffing establishment, and if any one of those individuals were to fall over, that would significantly compromise our ability to produce our annual report. And then finally, the dissemination of information back to trusts. Again, as we've discussed, the surveys also published on our website each year, which look at the degree of implementation of each year's recommendations. But again, those surveys, we don't have as many responses to those as we would like, and we don't have universal adoption of our recommendations. So we have a process. It's a process which has improved over the years, both numerically and in terms of the quality of what we do. We are doing a lot, as far as we can, to help trusts and reporting departments with investigation frameworks, with a human factors approach, and so on. We've put a lot of educational material out there. But it's still quite small compared with the total size of the problem.
Professor Newberger, could I ask for your reflections, please?
Thanks. I mean, I'll stick, if I may, to blood rather than transfusion.
Yes.
And I think blood is safe, and I think overall it's safe. But, and this report doesn't generate any red flags, but it doesn't give any cause for complacency. From the SABTO point of view, and indeed my own clinical practice would reinforce this, I've no doubt, as we've said, there's underreporting, but more important, I think there's under-recognition. And although I think in the acute stages, if a patient gets breathless after a blood transfusion, has a febrile reaction or whatever, that's fairly obvious. And I think the transfusionists are actually pretty good at recognizing it, maybe less good at reporting, but at least it's a start. The issues come, I think, when the patient, if you like, has had a transfusion that may have resulted in an infection, but that isn't apparent for some time afterwards. And my own experience would say that it's often not recognized, it's often not attributed to a transfusion, because sometimes the patient has no recollection that they've had a transfusion. Many transfusions are given in intensive care unit where the patient's obviously incapacitated, well, sometimes incapacitated. We do recommend that the patient should be informed when they've recovered that they've had a transfusion. That may or may not always happen. They may or may not remember that information. And again, for many patients presenting with, say, hepatitis or whatever virus or HIV, there are often several different routes by which the patient could have acquired that, in addition to the blood transfusion. So I think there's a very real concern I have, and this is one of the things that keep me awake at night, is the underreporting, the under-recognition, and I think many clinicians, and I know from talking to you asked earlier about colleagues coming to talk to members of SABTO, but I think it happens in reverse as well. They don't know what, if they do suspect it, that there may be a transfusion, they don't know about SHOT, they don't know about SABRE, they may or may not report to the hospital adverse event reporting system, which may not always talk to SHOT and SABRE. So I think, for me, that's where the real weakness is concerned. That's what worries me. That's why I think patients potentially are still at risk. We don't know inevitably how big that risk is. And another, partly I think because, again, I'm making perhaps a generalization, which I hope is not sort of offensive, but many of the people who receive a blood transfusion have hematological oncology and have a relatively short survival, maybe 2-3 years, where there are others who are very healthy people, either because of trauma or because they've got an underlying medical condition which requires repeated blood transfusions, but they're otherwise healthy. So again, for those people who, if you like, live long enough to exhibit the effect of the infection, so we know that those will be an underestimate of those who have been infected. So I think there's a very big cohort, and how we can approach that, we do our best to raise awareness of the potential. There are processes like SHOT that can examine the likelihood of it being a transfusion-transmitted infection, but it does require the patient to present with the condition or be detected. And I've seen, in my own experience, patients who've clearly been infected for some years, but it's not been recognized and then not considered what the cause might be. So there are many areas that still worry me that we need to try and we do try with education and information. It's a slow process, and it really worries me that this is a big lacuna in the system that, again, as far as I'm aware, MHRA and SHOT would concur with. But
could I quickly ask Dr. Cave whether or not MHRA does concur with that? I think it's clear from your statement you do.
So yes, I mean, underreporting is a perennial problem, and I think that brings me back to the culture, the facilitating, report once, go to many places so that you're not asking. I do think it's detrimental if an a busy healthcare professional has to report to multiple organisations. So I think a single reporting portal, from my perspective, would facilitate reporting. I think, interestingly, this gap, we know that we get better reporting when an event is temporarily associated with a medical intervention. I mean, because the reporter themselves associates the two events, and they may not always be associated, but it does stimulate a report. The longer term sort of ADRs, as we call them, or events which well, it would be an ADR in this case, an adverse response in the individual which happen over time, would be facilitated, I think, by clearer reporting lines for the patient, so that they can potentially associate it, if they are associating it with a transfusion that may have been a number of years ago. But also, I think, within pharmacovigilance, we have different ways to try and pick up those sort of longer term events. We'll use other data sources, for example, electronic health records. And in my statement, you'll have seen that within my team at MHRA sits the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, and that we use a lot to try and associate events that we're seeing in a longer term and were they associated in time with an intervention in a patient's healthcare journey that we could potentially associate. And that's a complex analysis. We have to look at controls, we have to understand what the denominator is, how many events happened, and it does require that, it would require in this case, for that transfusion event to appear in the primary healthcare record and be noted that a patient had a transfusion event, which I suspect is not always recorded in a field, in a structured field that we can pull out. So I think in pharmacovigilance we have a number of ways where we could address this. With blood products we would have a number of ways to address it. I think it is a challenge with blood and blood components to look for that longer those events which accumulate over time, which happen over a longer period of time.
Turning back to Professor Newberger, this is something that you refer to in your statement, and indeed Professor Bellamy does in his. The difficulty of making sure that a blood transfusion is recorded in the primary care record held by a GP.
I think that's just one step that would go some way. But of course, patients, say with sickle cell, will have multiple transfusions over their lives. And the analysis required to identify, and I mean, how important that is, of course, is a separate issue. But the important thing, obviously, the patient's welfare is the primacy. But my point of view is to say, why has the system let this happen? And how can we modify it? And to try and trace it back, learn what went wrong, to see what could be improved. That's the challenge. And with events like hepatitis E, where the majority of infections, are asymptomatic, but perhaps for this point, more importantly, they're acquired from food, and blood is a relatively small, but to me, obviously critical a component. So to identify what caused it, to trace it back to the donation, or as Professor Bellamy says, or as the donor, I think they're real challenges. That's not to say they shouldn't be looked at and they shouldn't be risen to, but there are sometimes real difficulties. As I say, sometimes people have contact with blood, for example, if they're on dialysis, to prime the dialysis machine, or for respiratory support. There are a number of situations where they're exposed to blood, where you say, have you had a transfusion? No, but you've actually been exposed to blood, and therefore the risks. So I think there are problems. They are difficult, but we need to continue to approach them. I think education of clinicians, education of patients, allowing them to report, but unless somebody's going to identify they have the infection in the first place,
yes.
Again, so I'm sort of being negative, but these are things that worry me, and where I think many of our areas for improvement lie.
Professor Bellamy, can I turn to you? Do you share those concerns that Professor Neuberger has just expressed? And Dr.
Yes,
Kay
I
as well?
do. Absolutely and wholeheartedly, unfortunately. The documentation of transfusion is poor. Largely because it's inconsistent. Much of it is on paper records, or historically has been. We're at kind of a transition point now where many trusts are moving over to electronic patient records, but those electronic patient records are oft-times incomplete. So part of a patient's journey is still recorded on paper. For example, in the trust where I work, blood transfusion does not feature in the electronic patient record. It is still prescribed, administered and recorded on paper, which then sort of disappears into some giant library somewhere and in theory gets scanned and put on the system. Now, if a patient receives a blood transfusion relatively early on in their journey, for example, somebody comes to an intensive care unit, receives multiple transfusions, then goes back to perhaps a respiratory medicine ward, then goes on to a rehabilitation ward, then goes home and is looked after by their general practitioner, it is highly unlikely that the junior doctor writing the final discharge summary on the rehabilitation ward will even know about the transfusions early on, let alone have any access to the details such as the unit numbers and so on. And the GP has no means of knowing about it. On the other hand, if we had a consolidated, consistent, centralised electronic system where the GP could view the same material that the hospital could view, then patient develops a problem, the GP could then hit a button and see the patient's transfusion record on a screen. At the moment, that does not exist, not remotely.
The history of NHS and technology projects is not always a happy one. How realistic is it to be able to have that kind of integrated electronic record that would contain all of that data?
SHOT at the moment is involved in an exercise called SCRIPT, and again, for those who are interested, I would refer you to our website. SCRIPT is the SHOT collaborative reviewing and reforming IT in processes in transfusion group. So we're 2 stages into that process. Stage 1 was surveying existing hospital transfusion laboratories to find out what IT systems they had, how often those IT systems, often called LIMS, Laboratory Information Management Systems, were upgraded, how well those systems talk to other systems in the hospital, such as the electronic patient record, whether they link into cancer registries and so on. That showed, it raised more questions than answers. So we have now done phase 2, which is surveying the providers of laboratory information management systems to try and get information from them about what their systems do, what other systems they will talk to. And there are 10 major providers. You can find the document on our website. There is a wide variability in what those systems do. There isn't any consistency at all there at the moment. So I think the next steps would be we need to define what the common standards should be. I can't see this being centrally driven. This has to come from, it has to grow organically, it has to come from industry, but we have to define with them the standards.
Dr. Kay, given your experience in this area and data collection and use, could I ask for your reflections on that issue?
I mean, it is a very challenging area. I mean, the primary record is better. We have 3 main providers in the UK, and that we have better interoperability and better linkages in the primary record. They are linked to hospital data, but it's generally linked to HES data, which doesn't give you that name-patient linkage. We're improving, and I know there are developments underway to improve and understand hospital prescribing. I think it is some way off before we get to a situation where we would have a UK coverage and linkage between the primary and secondary at scale. There is varying digital maturity across hospitals and hospital trusts, and there is varying approaches used for the system that's being chosen. So I think we are some way off having a UK-wide linkage of primary and secondary care. That would be sort of the vision, and that would be amazingly helpful. I was just reflecting back, actually, some of the comments. I think that, you know, when you look at this, you can see the acute reactions are better recorded and better captured. We're talking a lot about these chronic, the slower developing, the ones which are temporarily separated in time. And when the conversation, I was reflecting, therefore, how important it is to make sure the product is as safe as possible, that the collection at the donor is as safe as possible, that the testing is as rigorous and as safe as possible, and the distribution of that product is as safe as possible, because that will mitigate those longer terms of infection-derived reactions that we're also concerned about.
Thank you. So I note the time, and I was planning on leaving that discussion on essentially on all aspects of haemovigilance, the reporting and the use of that data, leaving that there.
Yes, well, we'll take a break then until 2 o'clock. So 2 o'clock.